So I happened across this channel called Coffee Break earlier this year, and it seemed like a neat little channel. I saw a few of their videos, the ones on topics I find interesting, like the art of non-apology and police interrogation. They seemed like a decent little channel, with a couple potential warning signs, but I thought I might have just been reading too much into it. Then I saw this video. I don't want to be unfair, so I advise you check out their video before you watch any of the rest of this. Their video is only a few minutes long, so it shouldn't be too much of an extra time investment. Alright, welcome back. To be clear, this video is less of a response to Coffee Break's video. I'm just kind of using them as a jumping off point to discuss this issue. I won't be going point by point or anything, just kind of touching on the general argument made in their video, as well as some arguments I often see in other parts of the internet. Coffee Break's video, for those of you who didn't go watch it, has a pretty simple thesis. The outrage in response to jokes is often fueled by the removal of the joke from its original context. It seems like a pretty agreeable sentiment, right? Like, context is pretty important for understanding meaning in a lot of cases, so it's reasonable to think that these jokes might be considered offensive because they've been taken out of their original context. Coffee Break's video specifically refers to the context of the type of language game being played, which is a fancy way of saying that they think people interpret jokes seriously instead of interpreting them as jokes.
It's the idea that language isn't interpreted only one way. Instead, language interpretation is based on the many different language games we all unconsciously play, which determine the way we interpret meaning. And these slip-ups, scandals, and faux pas occur when people misunderstand the comedy language game.
Now, some of you might be able to see the problem here already, but for the rest of you, I'll state it outright. This is not a suitable defense against any arguments made against the use of offensive humor. Why is that? Well, it's for a couple main reasons. For one, removing a joke from its context in a larger comedy routine is an argument that only works in individual cases. The fact that there is context does not then excuse the action. We first have to look at what the context actually is to determine if that excuses the action. As an example, let's think about a hypothetical scenario where a clip of me saying a racial slur was spread around the internet. If the context surrounding that clip was me going on a racist tirade, that would not excuse my behavior. If the context was me quoting someone else, it would likely be more excusable, although that would itself depend on the context in which I was quoting that person. Context doesn't function as a magical blanket that defends someone from criticism. Context is an individual defense. You use it case by case. Now, this isn't addressing the argument Coffee Break makes, however, because, as I said, they were talking about people misunderstanding jokes in a different way. They were talking about people misunderstanding a joke as being serious, because the joke was viewed in a context where it was being taken seriously, not because there were missing facts. However, this argument is actually even easier to poke holes in. I find it tempting to be almost dishonest in charitably interpreting Coffee Break's argument, because their argument, at least in my view, is so incredibly bad and misguided. If you want to argue that jokes are being misinterpreted as serious, I have one main point of contention. The fact that these are jokes is almost irrelevant to the arguments made against them. Louis C.K.'s jokes, for example, were not criticized on the basis of them being serious statements of belief, but on the basis of the ideas they were communicating and reinforcing. As far as I'm aware, Louis C.K.'s jokes were not meant to be taken satirically. They weren't supposed to be criticizing these ideas, and that's precisely the problem. The ideas in his jokes are bad ideas, and the reason people object to the jokes isn't because the jokes are poorly written or delivered, it's because the ideas they convey are bad. Even if we ignore the tangible harm those ideas are capable of producing, the ideas can be criticized on their own merits as ideas, without regard for their impact on the world. If you think mocking school shooting survivors is bad, then Louis C.K.'s joke about that was bad. If you think that dismissing criticism of bigotry as oversensitivity is bad, then Louis C.K.'s joke about that was bad. End of story. Underlying this argument is a strange assumption that a lot of people make, which is that comedy is somehow above criticism. Not that jokes can't be made poorly, but that comedy can't be criticized based on the ideas it conveys. This idea, as someone who's a fan of analyzing and criticizing art, is really weird to me. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you think about it for even a few seconds. Sure, if we accept the premise that comedians push boundaries for a living, people will likely be offended, but that doesn't mean that they can't push boundaries in ways that can be criticized. I can understand that a lot of people want to separate out comedy and reality, treat them as separate worlds that don't usually interact with each other, but that's not really how society works. Comedy is a product of culture, and thus it can both tell us about our culture, as well as help direct and shape it. If we think the way it's going is bad, we can, and probably should, criticize it. Like I said, I don't want to be unfair to Coffee Break here. I can kinda see where they were coming from, and I sympathize with that position, but comedy isn't above scrutiny. Comedians hold no sacred place in society. They are just as capable of saying dumb and bad things as anybody else is. We don't give a pass to anybody else when they say something dumb or bad, so I don't see why we should treat comedians any differently. For the slightly less charitable viewers, I will spell out that I don't advocate censorship of comedy. All I've been talking about here is criticizing comedians. That does not necessarily entail censorship of any sort. Even if the SJW snowflakes were calling for the censorship of these comedians, most of them are reasonably well off. They'd probably be fine. The point of criticism isn't usually to shut people up anyway, it's to get people to reconsider their behavior and ideas, and hopefully change them going forward. This whole conversation surrounding offensive comedy is one of the least interesting things I've encountered in my life, to be honest. The arguments offered in defense of the rich and famous comedians are often borderline absurd, and I don't consider this video by Coffee Break to be much of an exception. The idea that context absolves all comedy of any wrongdoing is laughably reductive. I kind of like the use of a philosophical framing to understand a contemporary social issue. It's an interesting premise, but it falls flat in this instance, at least in my opinion. It's a bad argument made to counter a position nobody seems to hold in order to defend people who don't need defending. Anyway, that's gonna wrap things up for today. I just wanted to add a short little outro thing here, thanking everybody for all the support on my last video. I wasn't expecting it to blow up as much as it did, and it's pretty cool that it did. I guess I'll do the standard plugs. I have a Twitter, which many of you are probably aware of, at icon_comics. I have a CuriousCat as well, and I actually also have a Discord server. There will be some links in the description, but the Discord invite's going to expire in a day. Sorry about that. I would leave a permanent link somewhere, but there's some long-term stuff I have in mind for it. I don't want to say what it is, just in case I end up not following through on it, but yeah. Hopefully that was suitably vague. Anyway, thanks everybody for the support, and I'll let you get on with your day. Adios.